A long gestation period. It has been fraught with debate, but it's good to see it getting to this point in the parliamentary process.
Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable David Carter.
Mr. Chairman, it's a pleasure to follow the contribution from my colleague Shane Ardern, and can I take this opportunity of thanking him as Chair of the Primary Production Select Committee for the work he did in bringing this legislation back to the House. Can I take this opportunity of thanking all the previous members of the Primary Production Select Committee as they worked through the legislation once it was finally presented to this House. The Honourable Damien O'Connor made some valuable points about the length of time it has taken to get this legislation to this stage, the Committee of the Whole in the House this evening. And it was, in my opinion, something to congratulate a former Labor government on, that they started this process in 2004, not long after we had had a hoax scare of a foot and mouth disease outbreak on Waiheke Island. But what that scare did prove to us, that as a government, regardless of which government it was at the time, that we were ill prepared if we had to deal with a real incursion. I want to thank the former Minister of Agriculture, Jim Anderton, for initiating the process, because it hasn't been without some angst out there and amongst the farming community. When NATE was first proposed, most of the industry was accepting of the need for a national animal identification and tracing system, but there was very vocal opposition from federated farmers, and that has taken a long time to dissipate. It is interesting to note today that as this passes through the House, I understand there'll only be one party voting against it, so I think we can all figure out why there was such vocal opposition to the original legislation, and it probably almost ends up being pointing a finger at one particular personality within federated farmers. But frankly, there's a new broom have swept through that organisation, and federated farmers now willingly embraces the concept and that recognises the need for a national animal identification and tracing system. When the Honourable Damien O'Connor listed a number of other countries that are well ahead of New Zealand in this regard, one he didn't mention, but one that really struck me when I had the opportunity of visiting that country, was Uruguay. There is a country with a very underdeveloped agricultural system, using a lot of New Zealand technology now, particularly in its dairying. They have already ensured that they have a complete tracing system within their cattle herd, and that for me was a real eye-opener as to how exposed New Zealand was, and the fact we didn't have this technology available and it could well have been used against us. There have been a couple of contributions so far talking about whether we have the latest technology, whether the bill has been designed to incorporate future technological advances. In my mind, this is a little like buying a laptop. You can put off the day to purchase a laptop forever because you know that next day there's likely to be a new model. So it is absolutely critical that we get on with this. Technology will develop and there will be opportunities to update that, but the legislation has been written in such a way that it will be able to incorporate any such developments in the future. Mr O'Connor raised two other questions that I want to comment on. One was the need to make sure that NATE, for its completeness, touches on the owner or recognises the owner on the lifestyle farmers. And I recognise that as a challenge. It is something that NATE Limited will have to grapple with. But I do point out that we already have a TB eradication and testing program, and already those lifestylers have the same obligation as a large commercial beef farmer in that regard, and to my knowledge the level of compliance of both commercial and lifestyle is really very high. The final point I want to touch on again was raised by Mr O'Connor around the inclusion of sheep. The legislation being passed in Parliament today is for cattle and for deer only. Having said that, I have no doubt that at some time in the future sheep as a species will be included, and frankly it needs to be included if we are to have a full comprehensive system necessary in the extent of a major outbreak of a disease. Mr Speaker, what I think will drive the inclusion of other species such as sheep is actually a recognition by many good commercial farmers that there's major technological advances to be had by better identifying the good performers in your herd or in your flock. And in that regard, I take the opportunity of acknowledging the work that the government's farming operation, the Crown's farming operation, Landcorp, is doing in this regard. Already, despite the legislation, they have involved themselves in RFID tagging cattle, and they have involved themselves in RFID tagging of sheep because they want to know the productive traits of individuals, because that gives them the ability to advance genetic gain to get higher productivity off their flock, higher productivity off their herds. And I think it's that sort of technology that's becoming increasingly available to the more progressive farmers, which frankly the less progressive farmers are going to have to catch up with and utilise if they want to keep up with the pace. So, Mr Speaker, can I take, Mr Chairman, take the opportunity of thanking the House for its near unanimous support for this legislation. I certainly do acknowledge that it is the work that was initiated by a former Labor government under the auspices then of the Honourable Jim Sutton.
Grant Robertson.